Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this wonderful Thursday afternoon, if you're based in New York like I am. Hello, my name is Emily Stewart-Hahn. I'm the program coordinator here at NADA. Today, we are thrilled to celebrate Reduction to Satire, the second edition of NADA Curated, a new series of online exhibitions highlighting artists and galleries from NADA's international community through curated thematic presentations. Organized by Curator Fatoş Üstek, Reduction to Satire features 21 international artists in the pages of an online magazine, a reel of sorts that brings together paintings, drawings, sculpture, and video. For today's program, we were joined by Fatoş and three artists included in the exhibition: Jorge Rios, Johanna Robinson, and Xavier Robles de Medina. Before we get started, I'll share a bit of information about our speakers. Fatoş Üstek is an independent curator and writer and who works internationally. Üstek is co-founder of Frank Fair Artist Pay with artists Anne Hardy and Lindsay Sears. Currently, she is commissioning art in the public realm in 9 Elms, London, curating the 40th, and excuse my pronunciation, Akbak Günümüz Sanatçıları in Istanbul, writing a book on 21st century art institution. She acts as editorial advisor and contributing editor at Extra Extra magazine, chair of New Contemporaries UK, board member of Urbain Kunsten Ruhr in Germany, advisory panel for Jan van Eyck Academia Netherlands. She is a member of the International Association of Art Critics, AICA UK, ICI, IKT, and founding member of the Association of Women in the Arts. She does a lot, and she's amazing. And she curated this iteration of NADA Curated, which we're very, very excited about. Jorge Rios makes paintings about first things that are untraceable by definition, such as the first sunset, color, fire, silence, morning. For him, this is a way to explore the power of ambivalence as a rhetorical tool to create images where the simultaneous, the absurd, the arbitrary, the sublime, and the ordinary coexist in a way that is both meaningful and trivial. Rios holds a BA from the National Academy of Visual Arts, San Alejandro and Havana Club, a BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and is currently a Chancellor's Fellow at Washington University in St. Louis, where he is working towards his MFA degree. Johanna Robinson is a Brooklyn-based artist whose paintings present curious menageries of creatures and objects entangled in nebulous webs, where animate and inanimate entities collide, interchange, and commingle. Figure skating is a motif reoccurring throughout the artist's practice, noticeably through subjects contorting and balancing in comical aerobatic displays. Robinson's work has been exhibited in New York, Los Angeles, Provincetown, among others. She received her BFA from the School of Museum of Fine Arts at Tufts University in Boston and her MFA in painting from Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond. Xavier Robles de Medina is a visual artist based in Berlin. He graduated from the master's program in fine arts at Goldsmiths, University of London in 2019. Known for his rigorous monochrome works, Robles de Medina combines a consistent, almost mechanical mark-making technique and surface quality with pictures drawn from a personal archive. His paintings appear to exist on two extreme sides of a spectrum, the generic and emblematic, and the highly personal. In 2015, Robles de Medina was nominated for the Prix de Rome Visual Arts in the Netherlands and was shortlisted for the Royal Award for Modern Painting. His work has been exhibited in New York, Savannah, Paris, among other places. We've got a wonderful conversation ahead of us today. I'm very excited for everyone tuning in. Be sure to follow the link in the chat to see Reduction to Satire, which actually closes tomorrow. So now's your chance to see it. Again, thank you everyone for joining us. If you have any questions, you can submit them through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you're watching on Zoom, if you're tuning in onto YouTube, you can enter them into the chat. And now, without further ado, I'd like to hand it off to Fatoş. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, and welcome everyone to this exciting conversation on the occasion of Reduction to Satire. I'm delighted with NADA's invitation to kind of contribute to their curated series. and also like be in conversation with 3 of the 21 artists of the show. Before we start our conversation, I want to give a bit of a framework or a background to the concept, because reduction to satire is actually a made-up word, and it's a newly coined term for this series. And it's a hybrid term that is, in a way, bringing a juxtaposition between 2 distinct approaches of engaging with truth. So with a background in mathematics, I've been very much involved in this concept of reduction to absurdity as a methodology to prove something as true or false. And it was, famously applied by Euclid to prove, it's basically reduction to absurdity is about reducing something and proving something's truth through contradiction. And it is also important to kind of like think about what is happening today. And I thought, instead of the absurd, perhaps the satirical, the humorous, the absurd could be expanded. And I was very much interested in examples of the satire in literature throughout centuries. So in a way, it is the reduction to satire, or in its also made up Latin word, reductio ad satura, is an intention to expand the space of speech, expression, viewpoints, and with the aim and the hope to catalyze new ways of seeing, feeling, and thinking. So, I mean, if we kind of like go back to this concept of the truth, it is about trying to identify what is true, but through employing an indirect methodology that is humor, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule. And what I wanted to do with reduction to satire was, because reduction is about reducing, it's about kind of bringing something to its minimal representation. So I was very much interested in translating what would be an online viewing experience of an art exhibition to an online magazine. Because as we all know, magazines are 2-dimensional, and they're already kind of like these platforms where volumes are translated into flat surfaces. So I was very much interested in this, like automatically flipping pages of an art magazine, where initially it was the idea of like a design catalog, almost it is like, and I wanted to connect the works through documentation of the works, like using install images to almost create like an imaginary exhibition, as if reduction to satire happened in a physical, concrete place, and that was documented for an online magazine. And I was also very much interested in, thinking about how could I talk about the works without necessarily directly addressing them. So I employed another tradition, which is also composing prose with a limited number of words, haikus. So in the magazine, alongside the images of the works that are selected or their install shots, you also see a specific or a special haiku specifically composed for the works. And we will be talking about the exhibition in depth, but I'm delighted that I'm joined today with 3 amazing and inspiring artists, and it would be great to kind of like invite them on the call, Johanna, Javier, and Jorge. So if you could join me now, please, it would be great. And our outline is that we will be in conversation for about 40 minutes. And afterwards, we will open the floor for your questions. So as Emily informed you, it would be great if you have any pressing questions, you can write up on the chat, or wait until we have our conversation ready for you to kind of like take on. So thank you again, Johanna, Jorge, and Javier, for joining me today. And perhaps, Javier, let's start with you. Can you inform us how you approach the conceptual framework of the exhibition? What did it evoke in you?
Hi, Fatoş. Thank you. I want to begin by thanking you and the New Art Dealers Alliance and Katenka Tabakaru Gallery for your work and for inviting me to participate in the conversation. My approach to the concept, which is a sort of mixture of the literary tradition of satire and mathematical logic, it's inherently colored by my queer, feminist, and Surinamese perspective. I think a lot about pop culture. I think for queer people, when it comes to satire, that space is really an incredibly exciting and loaded one. And the math angle here, I also see connected because of things like melodic math, for instance, in pop music, which is an idea of how to craft earworms. So the art of seduction, basically. Drag and ballroom traditions are obvious examples of where these ideas really shine. Also, with seemingly heteronormative pop divas, I feel there's also a lot of parody and satire coded within the presentation. Another example of satirical tradition I'm inspired by is from Suriname, which is where I'm from. We have a type of performance where women in traditional dress called kotomisi perform saying wisdoms called odos in a kind of highly flamboyant and very fierce manner. And it always strikes me as very tongue-in-cheek. It's important to note that odos as well as the kotomisi originate from a time of slavery in Suriname and a very recent emancipation. The traditional dress was designed by the wives of slave owners to obscure the bodies of Black women. So there's a sort of reclaiming of autonomy that happens within that performance. I was also inspired by Suriname's participation in last year's Eurovision via the Netherlands, because the chorus of the song sung by Django Macroy comes from an odo. The chorus translates to, "You can't break me, I'm half a cent." A half cent in Suriname used to be the smallest value coin, so you couldn't exchange or break it any smaller. It's tongue-in-cheek, but also intensely empowering and wrapped within a Eurovision spectacle. So generally, I'm inspired by a kind of empowerment through codedness in contemporary culture, or a layering of meaning or flipping of meaning. Another interest of mine in regards to satire, I recently watched the movie Showgirls from 1995. And my initial reaction was actual shock, simply because of the rampant sexism, vulgarity, and over-the-edgeness of the movie. Retrospectively, however, some critics view it as a work of true satire. Michael Atkinson wrote for Hoefe, the director of the film, "Maybe the bravest and most assured satirist in Hollywood, insofar as he succeeds in making big genre movies no one knows whether to take seriously or not." In part, that's a method that strikes me as overused now in contemporary art context, the idea of embodying the thing you're critiquing. However, there's something so gratifying about watching that film without knowing it's a work of satire and experiencing it as an attempt at a serious Hollywood film. It's a kind of car crash vibe that arises from the experience of the film's failure as you're watching it. I guess maybe someone like Paul McCarthy achieves that to a certain extent. I think generally in my own work, I do try to embody that feeling in everything that I make or within my methodology, like a sort of feeling not of shock, but of true surprise. So that's generally how I think about the concept of the show as well.
That's quite interesting, actually. And there is also kind of like, it reminds me of a description of art once described by a writer, that it's not easy to be surprising, and great art is something that is unexpected and inevitable yet surprising. I think that was the wording. But also, like, your reference to satire makes me think of the contemporary use of satire, makes me think of the 90s institutional critique embraced by the curators and directors of institutions, when they were trying to also kind of criticize the structures that they were embedded within. But perhaps Jorge, we could continue with you. What was your initial reaction to the concept, and what did it make you think?
Yeah, hi. First of all, I want to thank you, Fatoş and NADA, and then Devaney Projects for the opportunity. And it's very exciting to be a part of it. So yeah, as Emily said, I was very down with the idea from the beginning, because my work is about first fictional things or events that are by definition untraceable. So there is something intrinsically absurd and satirical about it. And this kind of like absurdity of portraying an archaeology of the impossible, while being kind of like an allegory of our instinct for kind of like looking for primordial truth and for primordial question, is a reference to time and finitude at existential premises. But I don't want my work to be tragic or dramatic, but kind of optimistic. And therefore, kind of like my primary motivation is to remind myself and whoever consumes my work about the awesomeness and absurdity of existence at the same time. So yeah, for me, satire is the best way of relating to the paradoxical situation between our primordial instinct, our primordial impulse to ask questions, and kind of like the impossibility of achieving any adequate answer. And although I not intend my work to be ironic in any way, but I think art in general should refrain from provided concrete answers, whatever the question may be. Since this kind of like more linear linguistic approach, I think in a way transgresses more kind of like rich poetical or poetic potential. So therefore, the overall tone of my approach to painting and art making is one of skepticism, doubt, and uncertainty. But for sure, there's a lot of sense of humor to it. So I think this kind of are the key ingredients to satire. So yeah, it was very on point.
Thank you for that. And it's quite interesting, actually. Recently, I was reading a paper from linguistic theory, and they were arguing that perhaps it might be that metaphors actually contributed to the evolution of human consciousness through building metaphors, symbolisms, and indirect ways of addressing things, the complexities. We evolved. I mean, of course, it needs to be still researched and tested. But Johanna, what was your reading of the title and the concept?
Well, firstly, thank you also, Fatoş, Nada, and Hessa Flato, for including me in the conversation today. I've been working with absurdity and satire in my work for a long time, so it was really exciting to first hear about your concept for the exhibition. When I think about the cultural value of satire, I think a big part of it is using it to express something that can't be said through other language, but then also, as Xavier and Jorge have touched on, that I think then one of the results of that is it doesn't always have the same meaning to everyone. So I think the longer I spend as an artist, the more time I'm okay with not everyone getting the same meaning from what I'm painting. Often I think about the titling as a way to make like an inside joke with the viewer that gives a little bit of a clue as to the context I want it to be read in. It is also really interesting to think about pessimism and optimism. I think of satire as a way to be like, to appear as optimistic about something that is actually very pessimistic, and getting these dualities and meaning.
That's quite very beautiful. I think it would be great to perhaps like introduce your, body of work to our audiences, and perhaps starting from the first the work and the works that are included in the exhibition. And let's go back to you, Javier, and perhaps can you tell us through the piece that is in the show, but also in relationship to your body of work?
Of course. So Gorillas in the Mountains of Southern Nigeria was the most recent work I had made at the time. And in my mind, also the most clearly satirical and narrativized in relation to broader issues like the COVID-19 pandemic and a threatening of the environment, and where these two ideas meet, which is a universal fear around animal and human extinction. I feel it assumes a kind of classic Animal Farm type of satire, where there's a sort of human personification of animals that happens, which feels appropriate for this context in particular. I wouldn't say my work is always satirical, though. I merely stumble upon it once in a while. So this piece, when not an anomaly, is one example of that. I feel within parody or satire, the tone or subtext is where much of the meaning of the work resides. So whenever I do engage in satire, I just hope that that it reads not as nihilistic, but rather as optimistic. And in a weird way, that's also what I feel from Surinamese odos, a lot of tropes in pop culture and drag, for example. It's aware of its own contradictions and sort of celebrates them in an act of hope and defiance.
Sorry, it took me a while to unmute myself, but that is a beautiful description, to be aware of your contradictions, and then to actually, through addressing and underlining those contradictions, you're building hope for the future, for its change or transformation. I think that's a very beautiful description. Can you perhaps tell us a bit of the works that we're seeing on the screen right now?
So the work on the screen right now is called Tiashit Yeprole Enkale, which is Romanian. The exhibition was based in 2 iterations in Romania. The first one was in another mobile gallery, which was in a van. And then we moved it to Katinka Tabakaru Gallery. And the phrase in Romanian means "the rabbit got in your way," which is a kind of saying from Romanian folklore that's used to express a warning towards a traveler, which I felt kind of represented the state that we were in at the time. It was towards the end of 2020. I felt it wasn't super dark, but kind of the feeling of a warning or something sinister that you don't quite know yet. And all of the references are to ranging from different art historical sources like Cycladic to South American references, kind of like trying to gather like a global vocabulary of art historical references. And this piece is of pop singer Shakira, during her performance at the Super Bowl. And also the beginning of 2020, pandemic had not yet happened. But during that year of 2020, I had just, Shakira's performance was kind of burned in my brain. I don't know if it's because of the shock of the pandemic or something, but that scene in the Super Bowl where she's dancing with the rope, I found really strange. So I kind of went back several times to the video to try and find that moment that was stuck in my brain and realized that it actually doesn't exist. And I created, by collaging 5 different moments in her performance, this image in a photo collage, and then I painted it life scale.
I mean, it almost has this kind of like shamanic resonance to it, to be honest. And it's also, you know, it's very important to underline the fact that you have a laborious engagement with your works. Like the gorillas, I think, if I'm not wrong, took you like 5-6 months to complete. So these are very meticulously hand-drawn pieces. Can you talk about that a bit, perhaps? Like, what does it mean to kind of have this like intense engagement with one image and building it from, you know, its micro parts?
Yeah, I feel the process in itself embodies a kind of search for meaning via an intimacy that I feel working on an artwork or an idea over an extended period of time. I develop a sort of empathy whilst raising the work, so to speak. I can feel intuitively what the work is sort of growing into and what it needs as I'm working on it. So I simply try to cater to that. It's often also the element in my work that gets misinterpreted by others. For instance, it's really not some fetishization of painting, and it's also not an ironic view on painting. For me, it's something more to do with intimacy, first and foremost. You know, I'm also aware that I'm working within a certain art historical framework and tradition that sees me as other. So for me, it's about flipping that and using it as a means to pursue my intuitive interests around images to create a sort of web of associations and multiplicity.
Thank you. I think that is very interesting, and perhaps that is a great bridging to go to Johanna, because I feel that, you know, Johanna, you are also kind of like a meticulous catalyst of symbolic associations, and I feel it's almost like you know, free associative writing that manifests itself in the form of paintings. Yeah, of course you can attest to that, but can you talk us through your practice, you know, starting from the 2 paintings that are included in the show?
Sure. Well, yeah, let me start out by saying that I do think you're right that they do relate to free associative writing, because I don't plan out much ahead of time. I start with a general concept, but I don't really do a lot of sketching. And then as I'm doing the painting, like for this one, for example, I knew I wanted to have various creatures like building their own fountain with their own bodies, but I wasn't even sure like what they would be. So then it's almost like filling in pieces of a puzzle, like building blocks as I go. So I feel like that is probably similar to free associative writing, that part of the excitement is seeing like what you end up with, and like discovering the meaning for yourself is a big reason to make the images. So this one's called Fountain Animate Structure. And then the other piece that we'll see is called Belly of the Beast. So both of these are really part of this ongoing thread of work where I would combine both animate and inanimate objects and then reconfigure them into a variety of arrangements. So I feel like it's for the figures involved, they're like trying to recreate building the world themselves, but maybe they're not succeeding because they're just building it in a way that mimics structures we're already aware of. So this one, it's like the animals outside are turning to use artificial light rather than the sun as a light source. But I sort of thought of like the forest as the beast and the belly as like this clearing in the middle with this gathering of arrangements. And then, but then, you know, maybe the electricity is coming from like some alternative source of electricity that's sourced from the earth. So there could be like successes and failures within one image where they're trying to remake the world in some way. And then with the fountains, I found that some of the satire is that the subjects are spitting in the fountain rather than drinking the water. And often I'm doing a lot of research while I'm making my work. So through researching fountains, I discovered that some of the mythology around wishing wells may have originated because the coins being thrown in the water actually were purifying the water. So people who were drinking water from those wells may actually have been healthier than others. But then like I don't really have any paintings of people drinking from the wells. So like the one with the fish, you have like the fish mimicking the actual fish then in the statue. So it's like a reduction to animate objects being equated to inanimate objects.
But it's also quite interesting that, you know, you are working with these kind of contextual shifts and they are in a continuum with each other. So it's very hard to kind of identify, let's say, inside, outside, or, you know, folklore, literature, I don't know, abstract, figurative. It's, can you perhaps talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's true. I'm really trying to put a lot of different things on equal playing fields. Like I'm searching for maybe truths that have come out of folklore, or there might be, like currently in the current world, a lot of folklore that is seen as truth in mythology still. So I think the paintings have like a DIY quality that maybe like hints at some sort of defiance at trying to get outside of like common knowledge structures, but then they can't completely escape them because that's all that they know, or even all that I know when making the work. So they're sort of like mental experiments to see what else could I mean, if I try to think of the most absurd thing I possibly can to paint, sometimes I think I can't even think of anything that absurd.
I love that. Yeah, it's brilliant. Jorge, perhaps we come to you now, and I think it's also interesting to underline that you have a curious choice for a canvas and a committed engagement with this form. Can you please tell us about the work and the show, and also like all your other prequel works?
Yes, of course. I paint on cowhides, and painting on animal skins, like hides in general, is I think it's important to acknowledge that it's a long-standing tradition in a lot of Native American tribes. Some local ones from like Missouri, when I'm currently at like the Osage, but some other tribes from both the Great Basin and the Great Plains, like the Kiowa, the Shoshone, the Dakota, and so many others. But those tribes, they were painting mostly on elk, buffalo, and deer hide. Cattle was later on introduced by the Spanish colonizers. So in general, cattle has this very ancient kind of relationship to civilization. Is also very relevant in many Asian religions, all the way back to ancient Egypt, Rome, and even Greece. And still, like currently, cattle is considered sacred in Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism. So I feel like it is such a direct, dense reference to this idea of metaphysics, and my work deals with creation myths. So I feel it activates this notion of the divine, the sacred, and the sacrificial in a very direct way. Another important element is this irregular shape of the surface, while being a reminder of the anatomy and therefore like the mortality of the animal, mortality in general. I like how it simulates kind of like a contour or kind of like a portal or like geological aperture. And in my work, I've been using the metaphor of watching, perceiving the world through like a cave. Obviously as a reference of Plato's allegory of the cave, but in a more broad way to this kind of like dilemma between subjectivity and the real world outside of the human mind.
I mean, it is quite interesting also in the sense that you are using or responding to the texture of the cowhide. So it's almost like you're kind of like creating a flatness of the surface by incorporating the details of the fur or the skin. But then you're also kind of like adding layers onto it. It almost makes me, like with your reference to mythologies and sacred religions, but it also makes me think about like the mythical or the archaic drawings that are also, very simple, but like simple contours, but perhaps like a really light shadowing to kind of create a volume. So yeah, can you talk a little bit about that, like your relationship to the surface?
Yeah, I feel art has a very phenomenological nature by definition. This idea of the experience of the aesthetic experience is very important to me. So, through images, we just have like a very kind of like core reference to what the actual work of art is supposed to do. So the surface is very important in my work, and it's something that of course we don't get through the image, but it's kind of like a challenge and a blessing at the same time, because I had to adapt everything that I knew about painting to this idea of working on top of the fur, and also being aware of, because I kind of like keep and conserve some of the original drawings like they're on the skin. So yeah, it's they have almost like a sculptural quality, in the sense that the surface is not like a passive medium, but it actively generates a very specific kind of like activates a specific feeling of softness, which is on the other hand kind of like ironic with the idea of mortality, and kind of like this idea between comfort and death. And I think those concepts, and there is also something paradoxical about them that in a way also linked to the idea of satire. So yeah, I like kind of like the complexity of that, all those kind of layers build up.
Thank you. That is very interesting, actually. And also hearing all of you talk a bit more about your works, it makes me kind of think about also how I approach to this reduction to satire concept. It's kind of like, I feel, like the presence of literature, but also of folklore and customs and traditions is very important in many ways, but I think they got amplified, their significance got amplified through the pandemic and through multiple lockdowns that we've been through, and also the complexities and the hardships and the struggles that we've been facing. But at the beginning of the pandemic, I did pick up these like correspondence of letters between Dada founders or the Dadaists. And it was quite interesting to look at how they started to form a rereading of like social culture and textures and what art is and what art can be. I don't know if it, like for me, I don't know what you think, and would be great to hear. But for me, it feels like this, like the Dadaists and the Surrealists were almost like marking this breaking point for humanity. And I do feel in a similar but a very different vein, we are, I think, at the kind of like crossroads. And for me, this reduction to satire was almost like trying to unpack these, like what what is the state we are in and what kind of turning point we are at is quite curious and important. And in a way, I feel there's so much to say about this, and probably we can continue talking for hours and hours, but I feel that there is a need to revise and rectify, like the definition of, like what is our boundaries, what are our denominators or parameters of our understanding of reality, but also our derivation of truth. So, I mean, at the moment, like there are many things that I'm questioning, and I would love to kind of like hear from you what you are questioning. But for me, exhibition making is a big question, like the future of exhibition making. The way we do exhibitions today, are they viable? Do we need to kind of continue the way that we make them, or do we need to change? Same thing that goes for institutions that hold exhibitions, etc. But I'm wondering, what is this diegetic thinking for you? What does it mean, or what makes you busy these days, your mind and body, with questions? Perhaps Johanna, maybe we start with you.
Yeah. Well, I do think it's interesting to think about the potential for other ways of doing exhibition making. And I mean, one recent example that I feel like gave everyone just a small glimpse into what that could be is maybe the world of NFTs. And although, I don't normally do much digital work, like I thought that was potentially a very exciting way to acquire like wealth redistribution within the art world. And just thinking about ways that like artists could get resale value of their work, or that an entryway into the art world for those that maybe couldn't afford to buy a painting, which is something I always struggle with, making paintings and thinking, maybe none of my friends can ever even have these. So as a result of that sort of thinking, I turned the coins of my paintings into NFTs, which I gave away for free where I exhibited them. And that's a bit like satire, because they have the potential to be worth nothing, but maybe they have the potential to be worth quite a lot. I mean, there's really no way to know if the market will bounce back or not, but just so it's for me, sort of regardless of whether or not the NFT market succeeds, I just think that it's exciting that there are new modes of thinking about art distribution that are taking place. And then another similar example, so I started thinking a lot about currency, and then in the same research, I discovered that a coin used by the ancient Greeks actually had the plant silphium on it as its form of the picture on the currency, which was a plant that was used for abortions. So then, like, also just thinking about like culture drastically changing, moving far forward and far backward, like how could a plant go from being like celebrated as the most widely traded plant? I mean, it was used for food and a lot of other things too, but to go from literally being on the currency to now like talking about abortions today, it's just like, observing very drastic changes in the way that things are made, I think is very interesting. Yeah,
especially the recent American shifts on looking at abortion. I think that is quite a radical shift that is perhaps not expected and needed in 21st century. To be honest. Jorge, what about you?
I'm thinking a lot about the potential or the possibility of a spirituality through the work of art. And by spirituality, I mean this kind of like mental state, which is non-verbal, non-intellectual, this state of like awe, inspiration, and wonder. So I just really intrigued about how in the era of TikTok and NFTs and YouTube and soon webinars, so what's going to be our experience of the work of art within this kind of like exponential amount of images and content that we are exposed to. So I think this has to be like some irreversible redefining of the relationship with the work of art as a tool for spiritual self-realization. So moving forward in my practice, I want my work to be a stage for the possibility or not of metaphysics. So I'm very intrigued about that. And I also want my work to expand into a more kind of like go from like the two-dimensional kind of like realm to a more like three-dimensional installation arena, and kind of like you were seeing in some of the images I'm including the idea of technology and like neon and LED lights as a way of kind of like bring this dialogue of the contemporary and technology. It's like a kind of like a metaphor for that. So yeah, moving forward, those are the kind of like the main concerns.
Thank you. What about you, Javier?
I've been thinking a lot about financial sustainability for artists in very practical terms. I'm also currently in a flow of painting that started 2 years ago. I think these two things are sort of related in a way, because I was able to scale up my work due to lower cost of living following my move from London to Berlin in 2020. So that's kind of what I've been thinking about a lot. Tangential to that, I've also been thinking about the idea of community in contemporary art. I really believe we create meaning communally and through shared experience. I would actually love to hear everyone's relation to that notion of community versus individuality in the arts, and if it's attainable, and how. I recently joined a collective called APT, the Association for the Palliative Turn. And one of the founders was telling me their motivation for creating the collective as a response to the complete eradication of communality in contemporary art in the West over the past decade. I also really struggle with that in the sense that I don't really know where to find this IRL contemporary art community. I do feel one way I found that more recently is through APT, for instance. So that's kind of inspiring to know you can create that if you really want. But perhaps it's just something that doesn't occur as organically as it used to. I do feel I've glimpsed it in different parts of the world. Like I feel that it exists for sure in Bucharest and Harare. And of course, this format of discussion we're engaged in now also lays a strong foundation for community. So thanks for that. But I have a question for Fatoş in regards to the term reduction to satire. Of course, we have 29 examples in the exhibition of artworks that exemplify this term, but I wonder if there might be examples in the narrative and literary fields like prose and narrative film, or does the term lend itself more naturally to static art and moving image?
Thank you. I think it's a great way of saying that these 29 works in the show are expansions of the term, and they're not, one-to-one correspondence, but they somehow contribute to, an understanding of what reduction to satire might mean or might become as a methodology. But definitely it has examples in literature, in film. I think about, let's say, mid-century Ottoman or Middle Eastern literature, where this dark humor and irony has been heavily employed by poets and by also even singer-songwriters who would compose impromptu songs or poems through their associations with the social and political charges of the time. And for film, it makes me immediately think of Coen brothers or perhaps the Taiwanese filmmaker Tsai Ming-yang, his book, film The River or The Hole. If you haven't watched it, I highly recommend. It's quite dark and heavy, but also at the same time, very interesting. But I'm aware of our time, and there are some, I'm curious if you have any questions for each other, perhaps like Johanna or Jorge.
I did have a question for Jorge. I was just fascinated by your idea of the first that you were working with as a subject matter for many works. It reminded me of this performance that I saw in Berlin, actually, of Miet Warlup, who did this piece about the first laugh that was embedded in this rock. So when the rock was cracked open, like the audience heard this laughing, and it was the first ever recorded laugh. So I feel like all of us are working in different ways with time. I was just wondering if you think for the firsts in your work to be occurring simultaneously, and how time functions in the way to the subject matter you're portraying.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's a great question, and thank you for the reference. I'll check it out. That sounds very interesting. Well, in regards to the first time, I don't have like a kind of like a direct like symbolic idea about what it could mean. Although I do think a lot about time in my work. I like personally adhere to understanding of time as kind of like metaphysically entangled with human existence. And I believe this idea of like the existing in a temporal dimension kind of like defines the essence of being and culture, art, and language in general. And I think all of these ways of expressions are only kind of like possible as responsive to the finite nature of existence. So yeah, also this idea of fictional chronology, this idea of the first. I feel like I have like a very kind of like a lot of like layers of kind of like meaning with this series, but time is one of the major concerns of my work. In that sense, I'm profoundly like Heideggerian. These ideas are probably like 100 years old, but I feel that very actual and important. So also on a more kind of like lighthearted note, this painting that is actually in the show is a love letter to painting itself. So in all those small like patches, there are a lot of reference to other artists or art movement that are very important and inspiring for me. And but actually I wanted to ask you, because you were talking about NFTs and cryptocurrency, but I'm curious because your work itself has this kind of like mystical and magical aura, like vibe. So I'm pretty curious about how you're going to approach or to connect these two realms, and how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. That like the ideas of magic and mysticism I'm interested in is when it does become reality, or vice versa, and like what sources we're using to find some idea of truth. And then for being an artist, and any artist that's creating something, if I can paint a coin and then all of a sudden this coin is a real coin, like that's very magical to me, like especially under capitalism. But to find other little loopholes like that, I think, to make magic happen in the world through various means, whether through art or other things too. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that does.
Great.
That's great. Actually, like I'm wondering if we have any questions from the floor. Emily, please feel free to interject us, but then if there aren't, we still have some more questions, I believe. And I don't know, maybe Johanna, do you have any questions for Javier?
Yes, I was interested to hear a bit more about Xavier's source imagery. And I wanted to mention to you that your project of the gorilla, it reminded me of a project I was doing years ago, but I was spinning Google Earth, and then wherever I landed, I would paint the image I found. And the most interesting thing I found was this Japanese mountain goat that was like staring back at me in Google Earth, and just the way the eyes were glowing reminded me a lot of your painting. So yeah, I was interested if you're thinking of your subjects as like suspended in time in this way, or if you're bringing further awareness to the moments before or after these digital subjects.
Thanks so much for the question, Johanna. That sounds so cool. It reminds me, your project of like the Google spinning of the Earth. It reminds me of Celia Hampton, actually, British painter who kind of, I don't know exactly the software she uses, but she logs in online on some chat roulette or something and paints whatever she sees on the screen. And it's often images of men masturbating, but also images of volcanic eruptions happening in real time, and she paints them very quickly. So they have this super expressive way of it's a super expressive type of painting that she does because they have to be done quickly. So definitely worth checking out. And I would love to see that image of the goat. It sounds so epic. I personally often do work from digital sources, though not exclusively. And I don't go out looking for an image with the intention of painting it. I feel like I have to find it. I have to find images by accident, kind of randomly, for it to trigger my interest. That's just something that I've come to realize is a part of my approach over time. And an image is mostly interesting to me for its allegorical potential. Like if I can recognize multiple layers of meaning to the image other than the literal subject depicted, that's interesting to me.
That's great. Actually, Javier, I'm wondering if we did a tutorial before when you were at Goldsmiths, because I remember your works, but you were making landscape portraits of Suriname, no? Is it right?
Yes. I'm happy you remember. We did a tutorial, I think in 2017 or 2018, different world. But it's true. I'm so happy you remember those pictures. Yeah.
No, absolutely. It's an amazing coincidence, and literally just through talking, kind of like, put the puzzle together.
That's amazing. Yeah, no, I love that tutorial with you. I really remember one thing in particular that you recommended I create my own mathematical way of measuring my paintings, which I'm still trying to develop.
I can't give up on maths. I'm pierced for life. But I think we had a loss of Johanna, and I think we're kind of like coming at the end of our time. So I want to thank you all for this really interesting conversation, and would love to kind of actually just keep talking without the limitations of time. But thank you, Javier, Jorge, and Johanna, who we have lost. But I'll leave it to Emily and her amazingly capable hands. And thank you so much for everything, organization of the show and today's event, Emily. The floor is yours.
Oh, no, thank you. It's been a real pleasure working with you, Fatoş, especially so intensely over the last few months. And right when I started at NADA, this was kind of on the docket, and it's been great to like see it from start to finish. So thank you everyone who is watching and who is tuning in. Let me just, there we go, end this stream on YouTube. Thanks for tuning in. Please make sure to check out the show.